You know the old saying, if it bleeds, it leads. And I get it makes the news, but I think it's killing us.
But the news is crucial. We need a functioning, decent news media to support democracy.
I think that what's good for news is bad for society. James, discuss.
Okay then, from the Attention Practice and Phonogram, this is the podcast all about the attention economy. Welcome to Can We Have Your Attention? Hello Claire, I want to give you a date.
Okay.
The 18th of April, 1930, and I can be specific, 8:45 p.m. Do you know why this is such an important and I think glorious date in the history of news media?
Tell me.
That was the date and the time at which the BBC announced that today there had been no news, and they gave up and played some light music for 15 minutes.
Oh my God, the dream!
Yeah. Ever since then, journalism has just been on a decline, really.
Sorry, they reported that there was no news.
Yeah, they literally switched on the radio, said, this is the news, there is no news. I don't think there's actually a recording of it, but yes, there is no news today, and then just carried on. Which I think is marvellous, really. It was meant to be a 15-minute news slot, and they went, there isn't any.
A 15-minute news slot. Do we think someone just had a very long lunch?
I mean, it was the 1930s and the BBC, so it's entirely possible. But no, I don't think so. I think they said there's nothing of significance this day, so therefore...
I mean, it's right after Black Friday. You know, in 1929, we had the stock market crash. We're entering the Depression. It's impossible to me that there was no news that day.
Well, the BBC, in its infinite wisdom, that day decided there was no news. And ever since then, you know, there's been days where, having read bulletins for the BBC, I've thought there's not really a lot to go on here, but still, there's always news. And the question is, I think, is that a good thing? And I kind of think it is a good thing, although there are days where I wish there wasn't any news, I never had to report it.
There's a lot of days where you wish there was news you didn't have to report. What do you mean by that?
No, there are a lot of days where there's not a lot of news happening, as in it's relatively quiet, and I'm sitting there writing the news bulletins, which are meant to be updated every hour or half hour, and there's nothing new to write in that half hour.
Well, that kind of makes sense to me, that you wouldn't necessarily have anything new, and that's a ridiculous thing to have to do, right? Like, to have to make up something that happened in the last half hour or in the last hour.
No, you don't make anything up.
No, I'm not saying you make it up.
Yes,
Yeah.
but you rewrite what's already there so that it sounds slightly fresher, so that you're not saying exactly the same things you were saying 3 or 4 hours ago.
It's optimizing content, basically.
Essentially, what you're trying to do is get it so that the audience don't immediately think, oh, I've heard all this before, it's boring, I'm going to switch off.
Okay, right. So you're trying to make it fresh for the audience in that half hour, so they don't change channels, right? But if you're the BBC, if you're a public funded body, why does that matter?
Well, it matters because you still want people to listen to your content. I mean, the BBC, even though it doesn't have advertising as its funding model, it still only survives because it has people wanting to listen and watch and consume the BBC in various different ways. So it's still important to you to have people listening, watching, wanting to stay with you, because otherwise, why would they pay their license fee?
Okay, I get that. But one of the challenges that I have is that, what does making it fresher involve? Like, how do you decide what goes into it?
So I'm talking specifically about writing news bulletins. There have been various days where I've done this on normal news days, but really what I'm talking about is days like a Saturday afternoon when the football was on. Okay?
Yeah.
You know, my experience is at 5 Live, which for the uninitiated is the news and sports station for the UK, for the BBC, the radio station. The news bulletins on 5 Live do not contain any sport. Unless something so mega has happened in sport that it becomes news, you know, it's strictly news, and then we let the sports bulletin reader do their own sport. So I'm talking about situations in which I have been reading the news and writing the news as well, and I will be sitting there. There's nothing new happening in the news. There's no new breaking news. There's nothing across the world that's happened in those 3 to 4 hours of me reading and writing the news. So I will spend my time as well as looking for new things that are happening to see if there's anything significant, I'll spend it basically rewriting what I've got, putting it in different ways so that when I come to reading it, it doesn't sound exactly the same as it did 3 hours ago.
Okay, I think that kind of makes sense to me. I think the thing that I wonder about, though, sometimes, particularly when I listen to the news bulletins, to me, there's a sense that like you're trying to find momentum in a story. So either it's escalating, it's either getting worse or it's resolving somehow, but the resolution has to be something dramatic has changed. It actually follows kind of an arc in some ways, right? Like the same way any sort of story does.
Yeah.
And I think that sense of pressure creates this dynamic where things either change faster than they need to change, they sound more dramatic than they need to sound, or you're like hunting for consequence.
So let me say, first of all, when you suggested this topic about, is the news a benefit for society or not? One of the things I immediately thought of was that I didn't want to come across as this kind of, the BBC is the holy altar of all news kind of thing, because I don't think that's necessarily the case.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important that I say that a lot of my experiences, or in fact, almost all of my experiences in the BBC. So I have a particular view on things. Now, I would say even within the BBC, there are differences. So not everybody thinks the same. The BBC is not, as everybody thinks, a homogenous organisation of people thinking the same. It is very much not that.
Yeah.
But in my experience, if you're writing bulletins, yes, you are looking for new lines. You are looking for new things to have happened, but you do not manufacture things. However, what I would say is that if you are not doing the news, there are other kind of jobs in the BBC where you have to think about the way that you're presenting what you do. Yeah. So I'll give you an example. If you're a political correspondent, part of your job is going to be saying not only this has happened, but what are the consequences of this happening and what might it mean for the future? Okay?
Yeah.
Now, in that, there is movement of that story. So yes, you are reporting the facts of what has happened, but you are also, because that's your position, you're also slightly extrapolating, given your knowledge as to where this might go next, or indeed what other people have told you as to what happened next. So that in itself brings movement to that story. So if you then use that clip in the bulletins, it might appear as though the story is moving on.
So I think part of my reason for suggesting this in the first place was when I sent you a very long voice note about this.
How does anyone you spend time with cope with your 17,500 minute voice notes?
Sorry, James.
No, it's fine. I don't mind. It's just, I'm just amazed. Like, I don't have time for it. That's all.
I know.
I mean, most of my messages, to be fair, are no longer than about 3 words because I'm a bloke and that's how I converse.
So I will say I don't send everyone in my life voice notes.
I'll take that. That's a compliment.
It's a select few who've opened the door for it. But when I originally suggested it, I think I'd been trying to figure out like why this was on my mind. And I think it's actually like a combination of things, right? So one is, I think the last few episodes we've been doing on mis and disinformation. And we've been working a lot with people who are very close to the news in different ways, right? So Rebecca Skippage being the really big one. But also, Sam Stockwell, who's tracking AI and mis and disinformation and primarily how that appears through news or how people interact with it. And Tom Garnett from Refute, who are also monitoring effectively, mis and disinformation that's built on news. One of the things that I was thinking about was just how many other sectors are over-reliant, I think, on news to get messages out there. So politics being one, but the other being civil society generally, right? So I was at a book launch the other week for a book about corruption in the United Kingdom, and it was written by someone who was the former president of Transparency International, still very closely affiliated with them. Great organization, right? Like really necessary, important civil society organization focused on tracking, monitoring, and raising awareness of corruption in the countries in which it works. Now, in this book about corruption, one of the things that it talked about was that there is political corruption. In the UK, it's lower than it is in other parts of the world, but it exists as it does everywhere. And he described having conversations with politicians where they said, well, there's just nothing we can do about it in terms of money going into politics. I thought that's kind of funny because they're doing something about it right now, right? The legislation, our next guest, Alex Tate from Reform Political Advertising, will come on and talk about it. Part of the bill amending and reforming elections is actually going to reform political campaign finance. And a big part of that is to deal with potential areas of corruption, or what the public would see as corruption in campaign financing. It's a really important piece of legislation. And I was surprised that it didn't get a mention. And I raised the question with the author and said, look, why not? And he said, oh, I'm just not up to date with the legislation, which is funny because we're in a room full of lawyers. We were in a literal law firm. I thought it was really funny, but as I was thinking about it, I realized this whole organization is reliant on journalists to tell the stories they find about corruption, which are really important for the public good. But because they're so reliant on that, they're not even aware they're doing this necessarily. They know that bad news gets more attention than good news. They know that problems get more attention than solutions. And with their very limited resources and their ability, what they have at their disposal, they're very focused on tracking it, but not necessarily focused on resolution of it. And so they're not up to date with it. But what happens is it just gets repeatedly reported that corruption is worsening. And that may be true, but it is also true that there are things being done to deal with it. And I think that balance gets missing as we look at a news cycle that is ever more pressured to produce something fresh every minute and attract listeners, eyeballs, whatever metric you're pursuing, that metric is retaining people. But the reason that people come to news or follow news, it doesn't necessarily serve the objectives of a civil society organization or a politician or, someone working in government, a civil servant, someone who's focused on shaping legislation or trying to change something. Actually, what serves a headline doesn't necessarily serve your outcome. But with everyone so reliant on it, we've gotten into the cycle where we're just chasing bad news. And I think when we think about, in particular, the importance of, our entire media ecosystem fighting mis and disinformation, I think we put too much emphasis on the news part of it and probably actually put far too much weight on what journalists and news organizations have to say about how you combat that without thinking about actually what are the incentives they're chasing, and does that actually serve the purpose of combating the wider problems this causes.
Let me just kind of flag a few things. Firstly, would you like a world exclusive?
I would love a world exclusive.
This is about to be piloted next week. So, whether it actually comes to fruition or not, who knows? But there is an issue that is being debated at the very highest levels called news avoidance. And it's this idea that people do not want to interact with the news anymore because they are depressed by it, because it's too miserable. It makes them feel worse. This is a very definite, measurable thing. I'm sure we can put links to research all about it in the show notes.
We definitely can. I actually woke up thinking about I was exhibiting the behaviors of news avoidance. Because I mean, to be frank with you, I definitely do. And we've talked before on this podcast about my own burnout, really, with news. So I definitely have that. I spend a lot of time looking at cultural things now rather than looking at the news. However, as a result of that, the world exclusive is that I'm actually going to pilot next week a new podcast called, working title, Good News UK, which is going to be a 5-minute or so reminder every single day that there is good stuff happening across the UK, delivered by proper journalists who know what they're doing. So it's not wishy-washy nonsense. It's properly good resourced, no resources at all, research stuff that we know is going to happen. So, for example, you might discover that there is a place in the UK which has suddenly planted a load of trees in a particular area because they've discovered that set of trees has particular life-affirming qualities or whatever. I don't know. But those kind of stories, maybe there's been a new cure for something discovered at a British lab, all of those things, something that reminds you every single day that there's good stuff happening. I love it.
Right. But as you say, most people don't tune into the news for that. They tune into the news because they want to know what's happening, and the news is often bad. Now, you're right in that I think largely bad news sells. Okay? Mm-hmm. And that's because people regard it as a life-changing event when something really bad happens. And often it is, and often it's really important that it gets reported. And, you can look at things like terror attacks and so on.
Yeah. And there's all sorts of psychological studies into this, trying to understand it. And one of the theories, I think it was covered in an exhibition called Breaking the News that the British Library had a few years ago, whole section devoted to it, was this theory that people look at the bad stuff to get some sense of balance or relief in their own life, going like, there, but for the grace of God go I.
I think maybe that's true, but you'll have heard, I'm sure, of the British Crime Survey. I think it's still called that.
Yeah.
So the British Crime Survey is a survey every year in which they ask people not only about their experiences of crime, but how they perceive crime. And it's always the case that people perceive that there's been many more far worse crimes happening than there has actually been.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I've got an answer to this, really, other than you're right in that I think bad news does sell, and I think people tune in when something bad happens. But there's a definite realization in newsrooms, I think, across the country at the moment that there needs to be a change perhaps in the way that things are delivered, or in the way in which the news is structured at the moment. And to give you my personal perspective, I think one of the worst things that's happened for society has been 24-hour news.
Oh, yeah.
The reason for that is that the 24-hour news culture, and by which I mean specifically the channels of, constant news, that has meant that you always have to find something to fill those schedules. And if you have fewer schedules putting out fewer news bulletins, you need less stuff to put in it. I say that coming from a 24-hour news and sports station, but the differences with radio, probably, and this is entirely my bias coming to the fore, is that radio does give you the ability to be a bit wider with what you consider to be news. So you could easily do what's happening in books. Let's get an author on who's written something about a major event happening, and that gives you a wider discussion on things. So it's not quite as hard news as it might be elsewhere.
That's talk radio you're talking about, basically, right?
Yeah, essentially I'm talking about talk radio in that situation. But look, I mean, fundamentally, I think the news is a good thing, and I think it's really important that people are informed and aware of what's happening. But there's definitely an issue with how that then goes to society, because as I said with the crime survey, people think the situation is worse than it is. Now, why is that? I think the media has a lot to do with that.
My hypothesis, I think similar to yours, is that the reason that people perceive there to be more crime and worse crime over time is because they, quote unquote, see it more in the news, right? Yeah. So as an example, we commented to my neighbors the other week that they were wondering why there were 8 police officers on the next street over from my house. And I said, it's a raid. They're raiding something. And they just were shocked at the idea that there would be a raid. I was like, well, we live in London, like there's drugs everywhere. Yeah, it happens all the time. I saw 3 in the last 3 months. They were completely, incredibly shocked that this would ever happen. They probably all believe to some degree that crime happens in other parts of London, or that crime happens in other parts of the UK and it's getting worse, but they don't believe necessarily that it's on their doorstep in some way.
Yeah.
And that's always been true. I think that people who perceive crime to be getting worse, it's not that they're having direct contact with it, it's that they hear of it so much more. But then how can you be expected to sustain, a growing media economy if you're not filling it with that time? Like, how do you report crime then if you need to report it but don't want to scare people?
But I think what's really interesting is we're talking in a week where the chief executive of Reach, which is one of the biggest news, in fact, I think the biggest newspaper group in the UK, has finally said that they have got their strategy wrong for years, and that actually they should not be aiming for mad clicks on websites in the same way that they are. Now, I'm slightly paraphrasing because I can't remember it entirely, but, the whole name of the company, Reach, I think, this is edge of my knowledge, but I think Reach used to be known as Trinity Mirror. They own a lot of the local live websites. So, my hometown one, Scunthorpe Live, or whatever it is, they own that. And that used to be part of the Scunthorpe Telegraph. So the Scunthorpe Telegraph was, for 100 years or so, a very well curated newspaper for the local area. Yeah. Well, if you go onto that website now, I mean, it's almost unnavigable. It's absolutely terrible. There are pop-ups everywhere. And often the news that you get for it will not be because of what's happened in the local area. It will be, this has happened in Wales, and we're just putting it on all of our different websites to try and get as many clicks as we can to get that advertising money. I think what you're talking about is the difference between quantity and quality. Personally, I think the media has got it wrong for a long time. I think there needs to be less news. It needs to be there less often, but it needs to be really well resourced and really good when you get it. That's going to make a big difference. But I think then you also, nowadays, you can't discount what's happening with social media. Like, people don't go to the news channels in the same way that they used to. They go to social media for news. They go to AI, as we've been talking about previously on this podcast. So it's a really difficult situation that news media is in at the moment, and how you manage it and how you try to make it profitable, or indeed, with the BBC's case, so that enough people are watching it and consuming it. I don't think, personally, the quality of journalism has necessarily gone down. I think the visibility of that journalism has been subsumed by so many other things happening that it's difficult to get that through.
One of the questions I've wanted to ask you for a while, I think, is journalists, they understand the metrics they're trying to hit all the time. So if you're in radio, it's retaining audience, right? Making sure that they stay there through to the next program.
And we should say, by the way, with radio, that people listen for about 20 minutes at a go. I mean, that's why Radar, which is the diaries, you only know how many people listen to radio, at least the old way, because people fill out paper diaries saying what it is that they've been listening to when, and they might not do that at the time. So it's all a bit of a nonsense, but obviously digital might change that a bit, but you know.
But Radar is still better than almost anything else in the world. So when I talk to people who work on, radio programming and building stations in other parts of the world, particularly in Africa or in the Middle East, they don't have an equivalent of Radar, right? They don't have people filling in paper media diaries. And anyway, like the way you reach people and how people get access to media is completely different to how it is in the UK and in Western Europe. So they're reliant on phone calls to try to judge, to get a barometer of how many people are listening to something. And in a way, it's worse because what prompts someone to call a station is very different to what people listen to, right?
Yeah. And look, there's definitely a thing, as I said, there's a phone in every day on 5 Live. I've sat in those meetings where people think, what is the best thing we can get someone to call in about? And usually that's something that will get the audience annoyed, riled. There are days, and every journalist, every producer I know loves it, where everybody goes, this is a fantastic thing, let's talk about why it's so fantastic. But they're pretty rare those days because you don't get as many calls for them.
Like, what is it? Like if it's, in Chicago, when the Bears win the Super Bowl, every Chicago station is going to be wall-to-wall good news and thousands of call-ins.
Yeah. I mean, if England ever win the World Cup, right, it'll be the same thing, okay? I mean, it'll be joyous for a day or so. That's just the way it'll be, and that's great, and everybody loves that. But the day-to-day grind is a grind. Now, I should say also that I definitely come off from a particular perspective because I don't like phone-ins. I think phone-ins are out of date. I think they are a relic of the 1990s or earlier.
I mean, LBC's built a whole business off of it, so...
Yeah, no, absolutely. But also, certainly my experience, that's my chances of any jobs at LBC absolutely out the window, isn't it? But in my experience, people don't often call anymore. They text.
Yes. Yeah.
They text in. So often a lot of the calls that you hear are people who've texted and then been rung back by producers.
Do we need a text number, James? Is that what you're saying?
No, we definitely don't need a text number. But, I think that particular way of doing radio is a bit old hat now. And I also, and this is definitely a me thing, I prefer light over heat.
Why?
Well, I think that's my personality. I don't like shouting matches. I don't think they make particularly great radio. And I'm not a completely unemotional person, but I like to understand and learn things rather than have, people screaming at each other and think that that's great radio. But that's an emotional reaction that I have. So there are other producers, and I can think of one in particular who I know who is brilliant at doing that kind of slightly shouty, argumentative thing on the radio and makes it sound great. It's just not my thing.
Yeah, I think it's getting increasingly difficult to do that, but it hasn't necessarily stopped the focus on bad over good. I think part of it is it is easy to report. And also I think for social media in particular, as and pushing journalists more into social media, I think is going to exacerbate this a lot. There's a reason it's Zoom lane, and it's easier to make, it's easier to report, and it's easier to get eyeballs than it is to do the opposite. At the beginning of my time working in advertising, like one of the very first pieces of advice that I got was shock gets attention and it's very memorable, but so is genuine laughter, surprise, hilarity, but it's much harder to do. And they're like, that is much more effective, but it's way harder to do. So you have to have exceptional creative, you have to have a great story, you don't get it as often. So like the effort they have to put in to do that, it doesn't get rewarded. Now, if you're looking now at social media, where they're trying to fill this massive just hole of constantly feeding new content to people, it's almost by design, and it has by design ended up being just a cesspit of terrible, bad, sad, awful things, because that definitely holds attention, but it's just easier to make. And you end up in this vortex where you're competing in it. And I can just see as more journalists go into it and are building, their personal networks, in places like TikTok or Instagram or anything like that, trying to compete with people who are doing Get Ready With Me or shouting at their husbands or like whatever it is we're doing.
One of the things that make me think about is we're in the middle of the football transfer window at the moment.
Oh, yeah.
And I think what's been fascinating is the way that certain football journalists, and that's definitely in quotation marks, are being viewed now on things like Twitter. So you look at somebody like, and I have no idea if this is his real name, but Fabrizio Romano, right? Yeah. Who actually now has got to the point where, because he has been seen as jumping on various journalists' different exclusive scoops, whatever, reporting stuff that is definitely not true. In the case of, for example, the former Newcastle footballer Christian Atsu, who was caught up in the Turkish earthquake. I may have got the details slightly wrong, but basically I believe that he said that he'd been found alive and there were 6 more days until he was actually found dead under a building. He's now been banned by the moderators of Reddit's soccer channel and various other things. Now, I think half the problem here is, again, we go back to that quality versus quantity issue,
Yeah.
Is he a quality journalist? Well, I would argue he's not a quality journalist. But, there are qualifications for journalism, but it's quite difficult to actually say to somebody, you're not a journalist. And we see all these kind of, quote unquote, again, journalists on social media. Well, you don't know where the funding for them is coming from to start off with, and you don't know what they're trying to say. And that's why I think it's really important to have a very strong, properly funded news media.
Yeah.
Claire, you know that I've set up a business, it's called Phonogram. I do media analysis, I do media training, I do media coaching. I'm bound to think that some of this stuff is important and that the media is important. But actually, I think for society, it is a good thing. And you only need to look at, again this week, Martin Ziegler, who is a reporter for The Times, who is the one who has uncovered this whole FIFA scandal, to the extent where if he hadn't done that, even people on FIFA's own executive committee, the biggest body in FIFA, would not know about it. Now that's journalism. That's amazing, incredible journalism, which wouldn't happen without a really strong news media.
Yeah, and he also uncovered the Super League scandal as well a few years ago too.
Absolutely. So, there are great journalists doing great work. It's just highlighting that. And my personal opinion is that, we need to concentrate on that great journalism, but then people are used to a culture in which the news is always available. It's a balance. And remember, if you don't have the viewers or the listeners for it, it doesn't get made. So I used to work on a program called Up All Night on 5 Live, which no longer exists because there isn't enough money and there probably isn't the listenership to maintain that program overnight, which is a great shame because I loved it. But, it no longer exists in the form that it did. It's now a phone-in.
Yeah, and I don't know how these decisions are going to get made as everything moves to podcast format or, things get unfunded so quickly. Where are these stories going to come from? I actually listened to a podcast from The Times about that scoop, completely by accident right before we've done this. I think this morning when I woke up, talking about that story. And at the end of the podcast, I said, the person interviewing Martin Ziegler saying, it was reported a couple of days prior when the story first broke. We said, is it getting the traction that you thought it would? Because the story should be bigger than the Super League. He sort of demurred on it. And my sense was it wasn't. It wasn't getting the same traction that the Super League got. Now, I think if you remember the Super League, like I live in London, James, you've covered sports forever. People were in the streets.
Yeah, I mean, but then I think the difference is in that story that spoke to their own deeply held love for their club, which is basically religion, right?
Yes.
And what was being done to their club as they saw it. Either that they were no longer being in the English leagues that they'd always known and loved, or they were excluded from the whole project.
Yeah.
Whereas this is basically an old-fashioned tale of alleged corruption, I should say, at the highest levels of an international body. And so I think the nature of the story itself changes people's reaction to it. People will be looking at this and thinking, it's a really interesting story, but I don't think most people will actually bat an eyelid. I think if it's something that directly affects their club, they'll be much more involved in it.
Yeah.
But I think that shows you the fact that story was exposed by a journalist, and the fact that you had so many other things in the last few years which have been exposed by journalists, things like, just off the top of my head in the UK, the cash for questions in Westminster, the COVID, all of that, like that stuff. Even, what was it called?
Scandals.
Captain Tom. Like all of this stuff came about because of journalists, right? So you do need, I think, a really strong news media to make sure that your society operates effectively. The problem we have at the moment, in my opinion, is how that news media is funded and making sure that people realise the role of it. And I don't think a lot of people understand it.
Yeah.
And yes, you can argue, I think quite rightly, that there have been massive excesses in the UK, in particular in the print media. And we should say for people who are abroad that it's almost pretty much a direct swap, actually, between the papers and the print media in the UK and the US as to how they react. So the UK broadcast media is much more like the US print media, I think, certainly in terms of like the broadsheets, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the UK print media is much more like the kind of crazy TV channels that we just can't imagine in the UK. So, but a lot of this, I think, comes back to regulation, and it comes back to regulation and support of that, and having constant criticism of your main media channels by politicians, by others, is not helpful for that society, in my opinion. I just wanted to say, like, from my perspective, I could go on for hours, so I'm not going to go on for hours about this because that will bore everybody. But if you do want to know more, I have a fantastic media company that offers great media training and media analysis. Claire, put all the details in the show notes. Go to it. Anyway, sorry.
He does, and I highly recommend that that anyone do this, because I've also learned quite a lot, and it does make you more adept at dealing with journalists and thinking in that way too. Like James, and not me. I am not a journalist. I just need to stress that for all of our listeners. I'm not a journalist. James is a journalist. I am not a journalist. I agree with you that we need a functioning, well-regulated. I think actually the UK news industry, it does resist some levels of regulation. I think BBC is the only maybe official news organization.
So Ofcom is now the regulator for the BBC. For many years, the BBC regulated itself, but Ofcom is now the regulator. The problem is that Ofcom's regulators are sometimes political appointees. I think that's correct, or at least arm's length political appointees. And so you've now ended up in a situation in the UK where you've got a channel like GB News. For me, GB News is a case of Ofcom being asleep at the wheel. I understand that GB News, and I know you've gone away and had a look at this. So GB News is basically a mixture of news and entertainment, right? So some programs are news, some programs are entertainment, but as a viewer, it's incredibly difficult to tell which is which, and they're both held to different standards.
Yeah. It's news and non-news. Every 24-hour news channel does this, but the way that they draw the distinction is they make really clear visual and audio and programming definitions between news and non-news. The challenge from Ofcom was that GB News broke that by blurring those boundaries. So politicians took on the role of news presenters, looked like news presenters, an average viewer wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the two.
It's the only channel I think that has got a negative net trust rating at the moment. For me, the nature of that channel is actually reducing the overall net trust of news in this country.
Yeah.
I would say the same thing if there were a left-wing channel doing exactly the same thing. And I don't think there is. There are, obviously stuff online, but that doesn't get the same regulation.
There have been attempts, but they can't find the audience. They can't find the audience on TV. They can find it online, and they have found it online, but they can't find it on TV because, let's face it, the average TV viewer, and especially a TV viewer of news, is older, and they do tend to be more conservative. GB News actually makes sense as a TV channel from just a pure commercial point of view, but you don't have a left-wing equivalent because there's no commercial sense in it. And there probably won't be, maybe ever. I'd be shocked if that changes.
Yeah.
I see your point about eroding the trust in news generally, but I think actually that trust was eroded by the press over a number of period of years, not least because, the well-documented challenges about IFSO being a fit regulatory body.
Yeah, and I see that, definitely. I know there are print journalists who would argue and say, well, if you completely regulate us in the same way, then you won't get the free media that brings you those corruption scandals that they're very good at doing.
Yeah, it's a trade-off for sure.
I really don't think there's an easy solution. I do also think that there is a big difference here between my experience. I want to be clear about this, because the BBC breaks very few stories. And the reason that the BBC breaks very few stories, there are a number of reasons, not least the amount of editorial checks that needs to happen. But the reason that that doesn't happen in the same way that it might do with newspapers is largely because the BBC has to spend a lot of money in continuously broadcasting. And so it doesn't have the same level of, okay, we can just do a page less in the paper if we need to. I'm paraphrasing. I'm not sure how many papers would do
I also
that.
think it has a different mandate, a completely different mandate.
Which brings us back to the main point, which is, great stories sell. Those great stories are often, they might be miserable, they might be terrible, but they're still important for society that they get out there.
Some of them aren't. Right?
There we go. That's our answer. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you.